Hello, everyone. Before we begin, I'd like you to imagine something. Imagine standing beside a river. The water moves quietly, without effort, without hesitation, without asking for permission. It simply flows, day after day, season after season. The river never seems to struggle. It never seems to force itself forward. And yet, it reaches places that seem impossibly far away. Perhaps you've noticed something similar. When listening to fluent English speakers, their words seem to flow. One sentence becomes another. One idea becomes another. Everything feels natural, easy, light, almost effortless. And when we watch them, many of us think the same thing. Why does English feel so different for me? Maybe you've experienced this before. Most people have. You sit down to speak English. You know the words, at least some of them. You know the grammar, at least enough to build a sentence. But somehow, everything feels heavy. You search for words. You rearrange sentences. You correct yourself. You think and think and think again. A simple sentence feels like hard work. A short conversation feels exhausting. And by the end, you feel tired. Not because speaking is physically difficult, but because thinking about every part of it is. There is nothing unusual about this. In fact, it may be one of the most common experiences among language learners. At first, many people believe the problem is knowledge. They think, if I learn more words, it will become easy. If I study more grammar, it will become easy. If I memorize more expressions, it will become easy. And certainly, knowledge matters. Words matter. Grammar matters. Practice matters. But perhaps there is another reason English feels heavy. A reason many learners never notice. Imagine learning how to ride a bicycle. The first day feels strange. You think about the handlebars, the pedals, your balance, the road. Everything requires attention. Nothing feels natural. You are not simply riding. You are managing dozens of small tasks at once. And because of that, the experience feels heavy. Not because the bicycle is heavy, but because your attention is. Life has a way of teaching us this lesson again and again. The more we must consciously control, the heavier an experience feels. Imagine carrying a cup filled to the very top with water. Every step requires attention. Every movement matters. You walk carefully, slowly. The cup itself is light, but the effort feels heavy. Now imagine carrying an empty cup. The cup weighs almost the same, yet the experience feels completely different. Why? Because the attention disappeared. Perhaps language learning works in a similar way. At first, English demands attention. Every sentence demands attention. Every word demands attention. Every conversation demands attention. And attention is energy. The more attention something requires, the heavier it feels. Maybe you've experienced this outside language learning too. Imagine driving a car for the very first time. The mirrors, the steering wheel, the traffic, the speed, the signals. Everything feels overwhelming. Every action requires conscious effort. But years later, something changes. You drive while having conversations, while listening to music, while thinking about your day. Not because driving became easier, but because your relationship with driving changed. The same thing often happens with English. But there is another reason natural English feels light, and this reason may be even more important. Imagine a swimmer entering the ocean. At first, the swimmer fights the water. Every wave feels like an obstacle. Every movement feels difficult. The swimmer becomes tired very quickly, not because the ocean is against them, but because they are resisting it. Then something changes. The swimmer learns how to move with the water, not against it. The ocean remains the same. The waves remain the same. Yet the experience becomes completely different. Perhaps many English learners spend years fighting the language, fighting mistakes, fighting accents, fighting uncertainty, fighting every imperfect sentence. And in that struggle, English becomes heavier than it needs to be. Maybe you've noticed something interesting. Children rarely seem afraid of making mistakes. They say the wrong word, then another wrong word, then another. And somehow, they continue speaking. They continue exploring. They continue learning. Adults often take a different path. We want to sound correct. We want to sound intelligent. We want to avoid mistakes. And while these goals are understandable, they sometimes create a hidden burden, a burden called self-consciousness. Imagine trying to dance while constantly watching yourself in a mirror. Every movement would feel awkward. Every mistake would feel larger. Every step would feel unnatural. The problem would not be the dance. The problem would be the constant observation. Many language learners experience something similar. They are not only speaking English, they are watching themselves speak English, judging themselves, evaluating themselves, correcting themselves, and that creates weight. A weight invisible to everyone else, but very real to the learner. Perhaps this is why fluent speakers often appear relaxed. They are not spending all their energy monitoring themselves. They are focused on the conversation, the story, the connection, the person in front of them, and because their attention has moved away from themselves, the language begins to feel lighter. A tree does not grow by staring at its roots. A river does not flow by analyzing every drop of water. And perhaps language becomes natural when we stop focusing entirely on the language itself, when our attention shifts from performance to communication, from perfection to connection, from fear to curiosity. Many people spend years learning this lesson. Some learn it early, others much later, but eventually, most fluent speakers discover the same truth. Natural English does not feel light because it requires no effort. It feels light because the effort changes. The effort is no longer spent fighting the language. The effort is spent sharing ideas, building relationships, telling stories, expressing thoughts, living. And perhaps that is where our story begins to go deeper. Because if natural English feels light, not because of talent, but because of a different relationship with the language, then an important question appears. How does that relationship change? What allows English to move from something we constantly carry to something that quietly carries us? And perhaps that is where the real journey begins. Perhaps the journey begins with a simple realization. The weight was never coming only from English. Much of the weight was coming from the way we were carrying it. Imagine two people walking along the same path. The road is identical. The weather is identical. The distance is identical. And yet, one person seems exhausted, while the other walks with ease. At first, this doesn't make much sense until you notice something important. The first traveler is carrying a large backpack. The second traveler is not. The path was never the problem. The burden was. Perhaps many language learners experience something similar. They are not only carrying English, they are carrying expectations. Expectations about how fast they should improve, how fluent they should sound, how many words they should know by now, how confident they should feel. And little by little, those expectations become heavier than the language itself. Maybe you've experienced this before. Most people have. You finish a conversation in English. Nothing terrible happened. The other person understood you. The conversation continued. Everything was fine. Yet afterward, your mind begins reviewing every mistake, every pause, every awkward moment, every sentence you wish you had said differently. The conversation is over, but inside your mind, it continues. Again, and again, and again. It's a very human tendency. The mind often focuses on what went wrong, rarely on what went right. Imagine receiving 10 messages. 9 are kind. 1 is critical. Which one do most people remember? Usually the critical one. Not because it is more important, but because the mind pays special attention to problems. The same thing happens in language learning. A conversation may contain hundreds of successful moments, yet many learners remember only the mistakes. And slowly, English begins to feel heavier than it really is. Life has a way of teaching us this lesson in unexpected places. Imagine carrying a camera while traveling. At first, you want to capture every moment, every building, every street, every view. You become so focused on taking pictures that you stop experiencing the journey itself. The trip becomes a project, a task, a responsibility, and somehow something beautiful is lost. Perhaps English learning sometimes follows the same path. Many learners become so focused on improvement that they stop enjoying communication. They focus on accuracy instead of connection. They focus on performance instead of participation. And because of that, the language begins to feel like work. A tree does not grow because it worries about growing. A tree grows because it receives sunlight, water, time. Language learning often works the same way. Growth happens through use, through experience, through living inside the language, not through constant worry, not through endless self-judgment. Maybe you've noticed something interesting about children. When children play, they are rarely concerned with becoming better at playing. They simply play. And because they play, they improve. Adults often reverse the process. We focus so intensely on improvement that we forget how to enjoy the activity itself. Imagine learning a musical instrument. At first, every note feels difficult. Your fingers move slowly. Mistakes happen constantly. Progress feels invisible, but the musicians who continue are often not the most talented. They are the ones who learn to enjoy the music before they master it. Perhaps language learners need a similar lesson. Maybe the goal is not to wait until English becomes easy before enjoying it. Maybe the goal is to enjoy it now, even while making mistakes, even while learning, even while growing. Because enjoyment creates something powerful. It creates momentum. Imagine pushing a bicycle uphill. Every movement requires effort. Now imagine riding the same bicycle downhill. The bicycle moves almost by itself. The difference is not strength. The difference is momentum. Natural English often develops in the same way. At first, everything feels uphill. Every conversation requires courage. Every sentence requires effort. But eventually, the language begins creating its own momentum. A phrase you've heard many times appears naturally. A response arrives without translation. A sentence forms before you consciously build it. These moments may seem small, but they are important because they signal a shift from control to trust. Imagine learning to swim. At first, you do not trust the water. You keep your muscles tense. You fight every movement. You try to stay completely in control. But floating requires something different. It requires trust. Not blind trust. Learn trust. The trust that comes from experience. The trust that comes from time. Language learning often asks for the same thing. At first, We try to control every word, every sentence, every conversation. Eventually, we begin trusting ourselves, trusting what we know, trusting what we have learned, trusting that communication is still possible, even when everything is not perfect. And that trust changes everything. Because the moment trust appears, fear begins to lose its power. The fear of mistakes, the fear of sounding strange, the fear of not knowing enough, the fear of being judged. Little by little, those fears become quieter. And as they become quieter, the language becomes lighter. Perhaps this is why fluent speakers often seem relaxed. Not because they know everything, but because they trust themselves. They trust the conversation. They trust their ability to communicate. Even when mistakes happen, even when words are missing, even when sentences are imperfect, a river does not stop flowing because it encounters a rock. It simply moves around it. And perhaps fluent speakers do the same. They keep moving. They keep communicating. They keep expressing themselves, not perfectly, but naturally. And maybe that is the real secret. Natural English does not feel light, because fluent speakers carry less knowledge. It feels light, because they carry less fear, less pressure, less self-judgment, less resistance. And that leads us to the final part of our story. Because there is still one question left. What does it truly feel like when English stops being something you manage and starts becoming something you simply live? And perhaps that is where the lightness finally reveals itself. Not in a classroom, not in a textbook, not even in a vocabulary list, but in the quiet moments when you stop thinking so much about English and start simply living through it. At first, many learners imagine fluency as a destination, a place somewhere far ahead, a place where mistakes disappear, a place where every sentence arrives perfectly, a place where speaking feels effortless. And because of that, they spend years chasing it, always looking forward, always waiting, always believing that comfort exists somewhere in the future. But perhaps fluency is not quite like that. Imagine walking through a beautiful garden. The flowers are blooming. The air is warm. Birds sing from the trees. Yet instead of enjoying the garden, you spend the entire time staring at a map, checking your location, measuring your progress, calculating how much farther you have to go. The garden is all around you, but your attention is somewhere else. Maybe you've experienced this before. Most people have. Sometimes language learners become so focused on becoming fluent that they forget they are already communicating. They forget they are already understanding more than before, already expressing more than before, already growing. And because they are always looking ahead, they fail to notice how far they have come. Life has a way of teaching us this lesson. A child rarely notices how much they grow. A tree rarely notices how much taller it has become. Growth often happens quietly, so quietly that it can only be seen by looking back. Perhaps language learning works the same way. One day, you suddenly understand a movie scene, without subtitles, not every word, but enough. Another day, you answer a question before translating it in your head. Another day, you tell a story in English and become so focused on the story that you forget to worry about your grammar. These moments seem small, but they are not. They are signs. Signs that something is changing beneath the surface. Signs that the language is becoming part of you. Imagine learning a song on the piano. At first, every note requires attention. Your eyes stay fixed on the keys. Your fingers move carefully, slowly, deliberately. But after enough practice, something remarkable happens. The song begins playing itself. Not literally. Of course not. But the music feels different. You are no longer building each note. You are expressing something, feeling something, sharing something. The mechanics move into the background, and the experience moves forward. Perhaps language follows a similar path. At first, English is made of words. Then it becomes ideas. Then it becomes connection. And eventually, it becomes part of everyday life. Like walking, like driving, like talking with a friend. Not because it became easy, but because it became familiar. There is something beautiful about familiarity. A favorite chair, a familiar street, a familiar voice. These things bring comfort, not because they are extraordinary, but because they no longer demand attention. They simply exist. Perhaps natural English becomes like that. Not exciting, not dramatic, not impressive, simply comfortable. And maybe that is why fluent speakers often seem so calm. Many learners imagine fluent people are constantly thinking about English, but often the opposite is true. They are thinking about their ideas, their stories, their dreams, their plans. English has become the bridge, not the destination. A river does not spend its life thinking about its banks. It flows towards something greater, and perhaps language does the same. The purpose of English was never English itself. The purpose was connection, to understand another person, to share an experience, to learn something new, to express something meaningful. And once we remember that, the language begins to feel lighter, because the focus changes. Imagine carrying a lantern at night. At first, you pay attention to the lantern. You check the flame. You protect it from the wind. You worry about dropping it. But eventually, your attention moves beyond the lantern. You begin noticing the path, the trees, the stars above, the world around you. The lantern has not disappeared. It is still important, but it is no longer the center of your attention. Perhaps English becomes that lantern, a helpful tool, a trusted companion, a source of light, not the destination itself. And maybe that is the moment everything changes. The moment English stops feeling like a subject, stops feeling like a challenge, stops feeling like a test, and starts feeling like a part of life. A conversation with a friend, a book you enjoy, a podcast during a walk, a story that makes you smile, a thought you can finally express. The language becomes woven into ordinary moments, and ordinary moments are where life happens. Many people spend years searching for fluency, and there is nothing wrong with that. But perhaps the deepest reward is not fluency itself. Perhaps the deepest reward is freedom. The freedom to understand, the freedom to communicate, the freedom to explore a larger world without constantly worrying about every step. Maybe that is why natural English feels so light. Not because the language weighs less, not because fluent speakers are special, not because the journey suddenly becomes easy, but because the struggle becomes smaller, the resistance becomes smaller, the fear becomes smaller, and what remains is the simple joy of communication, the simple joy of understanding, the simple joy of being yourself, even in another language. And perhaps that is the lesson hidden inside this story. Natural English is not something you force. It is something you grow into, like a tree growing into the earth, like a river finding its path, like a house slowly becoming a home. The process takes time, patience, experience. But eventually, something beautiful happens. The language no longer feels heavy. It no longer feels distant. It no longer feels foreign. It feels familiar, comfortable, natural, light, So if you remember one thing from this story, remember this. The goal is not to carry English. The goal is not to push English forward. The goal is not to fight the river. The goal is to learn how to flow with it. One conversation at a time, one story at a time, one day at a time, until eventually, without even realizing it, English becomes less like something you study and more like something you live. Thank you for spending this time with me, and see you in the next story.